Now that you have all of your blocks together, you're ready to start assembling the quilt. This quilt is not put together like a regular quilt. You don't simply put the blocks into rows and then sew the rows together. It's actually sewn together in sections, and then the sections are put together. It uses a technique called partial seams. I'm going to do a quick demonstration on how to do a partial seam. So I have 3 pieces of fabric here that I'm going to sew together. Obviously, nothing lines up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece because it needs to line up at the top, and I'm going to flip it over right sides together, and I'm going to sew, but I'm going to stop leaving a couple of inches unsewn. So let's go over to here, and I'm just going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. And if possible, if you can leave 2 to 3 inches open, it makes it a little easier to join your seams. So now these 2 are together. Now I want to take this piece and I'm going to flip it up because it needs to line up with the side of my green and the bottom of my green. Now, obviously, I can't leave 2 to 3 inches, but I can sew it about halfway. So I'm going to go over to here, and I'm going to sew and leave the last little bit open. Now, when I open this up, see, these 2 pieces together now line up with this piece. So now I can bring this over and I can finish this seam. And this particular seam, I can take all the way down because these 2 pieces line up. This is left open because it's ready to receive another piece here. Anytime your pattern wants you to do a partial seam, it will be indicated with a dotted line. So in this case, you would start sewing here at the top and you would stop about halfway down. So those are your partial seams. You always start where the 2 pieces line up. This quilt, as I said, is going to be put together in sections. We're going to have to use our imagination because obviously my quilt is already assembled. In all the other videos, I told you to start at the beginning, watch the entire video, then go back, do a step, and then sew it. In this one, I don't want you to watch this video to the end. I want you to watch a step and do a step. If you try to absorb everything it takes to put this quilt together, you'll get confused. So for me, it's just do a section, read a section, do a section. So we're going to start out with the first thing we need to do is section 1, which is step 1 in your pattern. You're going to need 2 6.5 inch navigation blocks, which was block 9 that we made, and 1 background piece that is 3 inches by 6.5 inches. We're simply going to sew those 3 pieces together with the background rectangle in the center. So that is our first section. Section 2 is steps 2 through 7. We're going to start with a 3.5 by 6.5 inch background rectangle and a 6.5 inch block 1 home north. We're going to sew those 2 together. Then we're going to take a 2 by 6.5 inch rectangle and sew it to a block 7 ocean wave. We're going to sew those 2 together. Once we have those together, then those 4 pieces get sewn in a line. Then we're going to take block 8, which is the road less traveled, we want the one that measures 17 inches, and we're going to attach it to the part that we just made. Once these two parts are put together, then we're going to attach a 12.5 inch block 3 sunshine, and that's section 2. Section 3 is done in multiple parts. The first part of it, we're going to take a block 4 great divide that measures 12.5 inches square, and to the right side of it, we're going to put a 1.5 by 12.5 inch background rectangle. And then we're going to put, then to the right of that, a block 8 road less traveled that measures 6.5 by 12.5. So this is part 1 of section 3. The next part of section 3 is steps 9 through 11. We're going to start with a 9.5 inch ocean wave block, and we're going to attach a 2 inch by 9.5 inch background square to the top and bottom. Then we're going to take a 6.5 inch ocean wave block, and we're going to put a background square that measures 6.5 inches. So once we get those two sections made, we're going to sew them together. Then to the side of it, we're going to add a 12.5 inch block 6 roundabout square. And that finishes part 2. Now part 3 is in step 12. I made a little boo-boo when I meant it, so just ignore my boo-boo. We're going to start with a 1.5 by 6.5 inch background rectangle, and we're going to sew it to the right of a block 1 home north. And then we're going to add to it a block 8 road less traveled. And that is part 3 of section 3. Part 4 of section 3, which is steps 13 and 14, we're going to take a 1.5 by 6.5 inch background square and sew it to the sides of our 6.5 inch 9 patch. Then when that is done, then we're going to put the 2 by 8.5 inch background rectangles to the top of it. Once that is complete, this will measure 9.5 inches. And then we're just going to take block 1 north home, and we're going to attach it. And that is part 4. Part 5 and the last part of section 3 is simply taking a 6.5 inch block 1 home north, and we're going to attach a block 8 road less traveled that measures 6.5 by 12.5. So now you've got all 5 parts. Now we're going to take all 5 of those parts that we just made, and we're going to create section 3. The first thing we want to do is take parts 3 and 4, and that's step 15. I know we're going back a step, and we're just going to sew those two together so that we actually end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 parts, because these two have been combined into one. So once I have put this together, then I'm going to take this block, which is part 3, and I'm going to line it up with the top of parts 3 and 4. So that is part 5. I'm going to line it up, I'm going to start sewing, and then I'm going to stop sewing, leaving a partial seam open here. Once I've got these two parts together, then I can put part 1 on. I'm going to line up part 1 along this line here, start sewing, and then I'm going to stop about halfway or a little more than halfway on that. So I have an open seam here, an open seam here. Then I take part 2 it can now line up, and this is a complete seam. So now I have section 3 completed. Now it's time to do section 4. You're going to need 3 pieces. You're going to need a 4.5 by 6.5 inch, which is your 6 patch block. You're going to need your block 10, which is your 8.5 by 24.5 into the woods, which is our tree line. And then block 4, which is 12.5 inches square, which is our great divide. So what we're going to do first is we're going to line up our 6 patch with the top of our tree. We are going to sew it, leaving 2 to 3 inches open. Now, then on top of it, then we can place our great divide, and it is going to be a complete seam. So now your section 4 is complete. Now that we have our first 4 sections made, now it's time to put all of the sections together. To begin with, we are going to need 1 background rectangle that measures 3 inches by 6.5 inches. And then you're going to need section 1 and section 2. In order to put this together, we're going to attach the background section, the background rectangle, to section 1, and we're going to do a partial seam. So from here over will be left open. So then you're going to put section 2 on, and this will be a complete seam. So 1 and 2 are now together. Now we're going to put on section 3. Section 3 was that large piece that we had already put together. This up here is the part that we just completed. So now we're just going to line the top of section 3 up with this bottom portion of section 1 and section 2, and that will be a complete seam. Now we're ready to attach section 4, which is this section right here. So what you're going to do, because remember you have a partial seam here and a partial seam there, I'm going to line the top of this block up with my background block, and I'm going to sew straight down, and that will be a complete seam. Once I have completed that seam, then I can go back, because now this piece will line up with the piece I can complete this partial seam. Once that seam is completed, then I can go back and complete this partial seam. So the bottom part is attached. Then you can come back up to section 1, and you're going to complete that step. If you go through this section, remember, do 1 step, read it, do it. If you try to think too far ahead, you will get confused. Okay, now we're ready to put section 5 together. The section we just completed, we can put it to the side. We'll come back to that later. We're going to start out with steps 28 through 32. The first thing we want to do is we want to take our little 9 patch, which was your 5.5 inch block, and you're going to take a 1.5 by 5.5 inch background and sew it to the top. And then you're going to take a 1.5 by 6.5 inch background rectangle, which is sewn to the side. Once that's complete, then we're going to put a block 5 traveler. And so that is the first piece that you put together. Once we've completed this part, then we'll go down and complete this part. We're going to start with a 6.5 inch block 5 traveler. To the right side, we're going to put a 4.5 by 6.5 inch background, and then on the other side, we're going to put a 2.5 by 6.5. Now these two sections are the same size, so they can be sewn together. Once these two are sewn together, then to the left, we're going to attach a 12.5 inch block 3 bloom. The next piece of section 5 will be steps 33 through 38. We're going to start with a block 5 traveler, and we're going to attach to it a 6.5 inch block 2 mile marker. Then the next section we're going to take again a 6.5 inch mile marker, and we're going to attach to it a block 2 blooms. Once these two sections are sewn together, they're now the same size. It's just simply a 4 patch that you put together. Then we're going to create another one. We're going to take our 6.5 inch 4 patch, and we're going to attach it to a block 1 that measures 6.5 inches, and it's the home southwest. Make sure you get your colors going in the right direction. But these 4 right here are just simply a 4 patch. Once you have this 4 patch put together and this 4 patch put together, then you can sew the 2 sections together. Now the last 2 sections that we just completed, we can attach those 2 together, and that is step 39. So this top part was what we created in steps 28 through 32. This is what we created in steps 33 through 38. So now we have this large assembly. Now we can start with the second part of section 5. And it's just simply taking 3 blocks. You're going to have a 9.5 inch traveler, a 9.5 inch mile marker, and a 9.5 inch ocean wave. And they're just going to be sewn together in that order, and that is part 2 of section 5. Part 3 of section 5, you're going to take a 9.5 inch traveler block. You're going to attach to the bottom of it a 2 by 9.5 inch rectangle, and then you're going to put a 2 by 9.5 inch, the single row of squares that you put together. So that finishes part 3. Part 4 of it, you'll need to do your partial seam technique. We're going to start up here at the top, and we're going to take our 5.5 inch 9 patch, and we're going to put a 2.5 inch by 5.5 inch background rectangle together, which will create this little section. Then we're going to attach a block 8 road less traveled. We're going to line it up with the bottom of this assembly. This will be a partial seam, and I'll stop sewing about here, leaving this section right here open. Once I have these 2 pieces together, then I'm going to add a 12.5 inch roundabout. I'm going to line it up on this side with the section that had my 9 patch on it, and then I'm going to sew a partial seam. I'm going to start sewing here, and I'm going to stop sewing about here. So that completes part 4 of section 5. Now that we have all 4 parts of our section 5 assembled, now we can put all of those together and complete section 5. We're going to start out right here. This is our big square that we completed in part 1. We're going to take a small rectangle piece, and we're going to line it up with the bottom of part 1. I'm going to sew a partial seam starting at the bottom, leaving the top part of it open. Now, once I have done that, now the bottom of this section will be the exact size of part 2. So I'm going to sew part 2 along the bottom, and that will be a complete seam. Now on this side, we can add part 3. This is the same size, So we're going to put this right up against it, and we're going to put part 3 in with a completed seam. Now it is time to put the 4th part of section 5 in. The bottom of part 4 will be the exact size of your part 3 plus that little background square. And we're going to sew those two together with a complete seam. Once we have done that, then this section will fit exactly here, and we're going to finish this partial seam. We're going to start sewing here because this will line up with this. And so we're going to leave this partial seam open and this partial seam open. So now we have section 5. Now sewing section 5 to the top of the quilt is steps 53 through 54. The bottom of sections 1 through 4 is the same size as the top of section 5. This will be a complete seam. Remember, you have a partial seam hanging open here. So now, once you sew that, then you can move over to here because you've got this sort of tree-looking thing, which this piece is the exact same size as this. Those two pieces, and that will be sewn as a completed seam. Once you have these two seams, you have two partial seams here. You can simply fold it over and complete that seam. And that way you have sections 1 through 5 sewn together. Now we can put section 6 together. It is steps 55 through 58. We're going to start out with a 2.5 inch by 8.5 inch background rectangle and 2 Southwest Home block 1. We're going to sew those 3 together just in a line. Then on this side, we're going to put a block 8 road less traveled, and that's an 18.5 inch block. Once these two are sewn together, then we're going to take another road less traveled, and that's a 14.5 inch piece, and we're going to sew it to the bottom. Once this section is together, we're going to take an 8.5 by 24.5 inch block 10 into the woods or tree line, and we're going to just simply sew it to the side. So that completes section 6. With section 7 actually has 2 parts to it. The first part of it, we're going to take a 3.5 inch by 6.5 inch background rectangle, and we're going to attach it to the top of a 6.5 inch navigator star. Once those two are together, we're going to attach it to a 9.5 inch navigator star. Once that section is put together, just simply sew a block 4 great divide that measures 15.5 inches. And so those are put together, and that's part 1 of section 7. And you see I goofed again. We're still in section 7, but this is part 2. Now I'm going to take a 2 inch by 6.5 inch background rectangle, and I'm going to sew it to the sides of my ocean waves. And you want to make sure that when you look at your ocean waves that you get them oriented the right direction. Once you get that sewn to the side, then you're going to sew the 3 together, and then on the bottom you're just going to put a 1.5 by 8 inch background rectangle. Once that section is done, then you will put a 5.5 inch 6 patch block on the top of it. This will then attach to an 8-inch as opposed to the 8.5-inch. This is your tree line. And so that is part 2. Once you have those 2 parts together, to put them together, you simply sew part 1 to the top of part 2, and you have section 7. Okay, we're almost ready to pull into the driveway and unpack our suitcases. We have our section 1 through 5 that we have put together. We have section 6 and section 7. Once we complete these 3 parts, we will have a completed top, or nearly completed. There's one little thing extra. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take section 7. Section 7 will line up with this perfectly. This is going to be a complete seam, sewing top to bottom. Then we're going to take section 6, and this will line up with the bottom part of this large assembly. This will also be a completed seam. Once you have done that, you have one partial seam left to do. And then you're just going to complete the seam there, and the center of your quilt will be done. Once you have the center of your quilt completed, you're just simply going to put a 1.5-inch strip all the way around your quilt, and that's done using a background fabric. Then your quilt top is finished. Now it is time to take it and have it quilted. The binding for this is actually going to be made out of your scraps. And you're simply going to cut your scraps into 2.5-inch strips, and you're going to sew them together just like you do your binding when you're sewing your long strips together using the diagonal. Just pick a random order to go all the way around. Or if you desire, you can come by and we can help you pick out a solid that you can use for your border. So then your road trip is complete, and it's time to unpack our suitcases and get back to life.